I'm happy to welcome Deanna Hens again this morning as our Thompson Lecture Series speaker. And this is actually her second talk, so thanks again for putting up with that. And for those of you who were not here yesterday, Deanna is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, and she got her master's and PhD from the University of Washington, a bachelor's from the University of Michigan. And she was here at NCAR as a source protege in 2003 and 2004. Besides her interest in cloud dynamics and high impact weather, Deanna is really passionate about science communication, policy, and expanding the scientific literacy amongst the public. And one of her career goals is bridging the gap between science and human interests to help science be more useful to the greater good. And Deanna's talk today is inspired by her determination to advance diversity and inclusion in our field, and she will highlight challenges and possible solutions towards broadening pathways into the atmospheric sciences.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this. Okay, there we go. Howdy. All right, so talking about science by and for all. That's my focus, and as Falco said, one of my deep passions. This talk is hopefully not going to come off as too depressing. I really hope that's not going to come off that way, because I think this is such an important issue, and there's so much potential for all of the things that we can do to really improve our field and improve science and improve the pursuit of science. This is one reason why I'm so passionate about this. So this particular image was actually from a pretty exciting moment. This was from the March for Science that happened in Champaign-Urbana. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I was immensely proud of what they were able to accomplish in ways that I think that were not pretty dissimilar from what the National March was able to do. So when we think of diversity, inclusion, things like that, especially for organizations that work in this, these are the kind of images we're kind of usually presented with, right? It's, some image of smiling faces, very, Colors of Benetton ad. I almost wanted to actually put in a Colors of Benetton ad, but I was worried about the copyright. So I found this image from the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Relations from the University of Illinois. So when we're thinking about diversity and when we're thinking about inclusion, I think we need to really start and ask a very basic question. What is diversity? What do we mean by diversity? So when we think about it, we have to get on the same page with a few terms, right? The first one is when we're talking about underrepresented groups, underrepresented minorities. What does that mean? So for those who are not familiar with that, what that means is that you have an area, field, workplace, whatever, where the makeup of that organization in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, et cetera, is not representative of the national average. So if your group, for example, Blacks or African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, if their representation is significantly lower than the national average, that's when they're considered underrepresented. And so the ones I just listed are, in our field, the historically underrepresented groups. Another thing that we have to think about is a term that's becoming more mainstream more recently is this issue of intersectionality. So this is an issue when you are a member of a group that is historically underrepresented, but you're not only a member of one, you're a member of multiple. So to give myself as an example, I am Black/African American. I prefer Black, that's my personal preference. I am a woman, and I'm bisexual. So I have a trifecta of intersectionality. Now there's other things that significantly influence this as well, right? So there's your socioeconomic status in terms of, where you fall on that spectrum. There's if your immigration status, there's your disability status. So there's a number of different ways that you can be considered disadvantaged in our society and how those things are inherently intertwined can have a large impact on your experience. And then finally, another term that we need to think about is this issue of inclusion. What is inclusion? Now, the thing that I think about is three main things. The first is that you have an environment that is welcoming and accepting, not merely tolerant, but accepting and affirming of people of different perspectives and beliefs. The second thing is that when you're defining what is your diversity, that you're not setting one thing as a normal and then everything else around that being your diversity. That's a very different perspective than saying that we want a wide variety of people, wide variety of perspectives. And so finally, the third thing, and one of the most important things in terms of that accepting and affirmation, is the actual valuation of those different perspectives and different backgrounds. So it's a very different thing to say, okay, well, we will merely allow people to be in our midst, versus actually valuing their value systems, their background, their experience, and inherently incorporating that into your culture and your workplace. So one term that became very, very popular, especially I would say a few years ago, was this notion of diversity of thought. And you may have seen that there's a wide variety of thought pieces, and especially in the business world, about these issues, like 9 signs that your organization lacks diversity of thought, or why thought diversity is the future of the workplace. I thought, when I was finding these titles, I thought they were pretty hilarious. So what does this mean? When we think about what is diversity of thought? Well, the basic idea is that you have a inclusive environment. So you have people of a wide variety of perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds, and people are going to inherently be using those backgrounds to inform what they do. The goal being that then you're going to get a wide variety of possible solutions to a problem, or a wide variety of possible approaches to a situation. That if you had a very homogeneous environment of a bunch of people who came from very, very similar backgrounds, you may not get. So there's been oodles and oodles and oodles of research that have shown, especially in the business community, that this is an ideal. That if you have the same people coming up with the same solutions to the same problems, or even thinking about the kind of problems that they want to approach to begin with, that you're inherently limiting your perspective to, well, make money, right? That's the main goal of business. Now, in more recent years, this term, I feel, and a lot of other people feel as well, has been co-opted. So a lot of the framework around this idea has been more kind of, narrowed down into thinking about, say, differences in political beliefs or political perspectives. Now, one thing I do think I want to point out is one reason why things keep getting punted into that direction is because when you think about diversity of thought, you inherently are having to have some very, very uncomfortable conversations about what it means to have a diverse and inclusive environment. That leads to very, very uncomfortable discussions around, among other things, race, gender, sexual orientation, all those things that our society has been inherently relatively poor at having serious, deep conversations about. So my talk is basically going to be making this argument that inclusion is a necessity, is not just a nicety. If we really want to think about moving our science forward, really doing the science of the future where we're going to be dealing with very, very complex problems and very complex systems, we need these great minds that think differently. This particular poster was from the March for Science again, but this poster was created by SACNAS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. So this is an organization that's promoting one of the most underrepresented groups in in the sciences, and promoting this idea that diversity is a good thing. So I'm going to be talking about this in 3 different ways, but they all kind of inherently link together. First, who do we allow to even get the blessing, you are blessed to pursue science, especially the atmospheric sciences. What kind of work are you going to be able to do? What work is valued once you actually become that scientist? And then finally, and this is the one I think gets left off the most, for whom do we do the work? Who gets the blessing of having our big thoughtful brains working on their problems? So this is going to be and this talk is going to go from everything from how we educate our workforce, how do we promote and compensate our workforce, and then finally, what kind of work that we do. So if we look at the numbers, this is where the slightly sad part of the talk is, right? So we look at the representation by the numbers. All these different lines represent over from 1993 to 2012, all of the different science fields. This is from an NSF report in 2012. And so what you see is that in terms of bachelor's degrees earned in science and engineering from underrepresented minorities, there has been a general slight rise overall. Certain fields are doing much better than others. These top three lines here are psychology, social sciences, and computer science. Where we are lumped in with the physical sciences. You can see that on that ground, we haven't really made that much progress in about 20 years. So this is for all of the work that we've been doing to try to change this, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And the bigger problem is that when you start talking about moving up into advanced degrees, and once you start talking about moving into leadership, things of that nature, things look actually even worse. So this graph is divided out where now we have the Earth, atmospheric, oceanic sciences split out from the other sciences. And what you're seeing is that very low percentage that is similar to what's seen in this graph. But then on top of that, now you're seeing the masters and PhDs drop off fairly precipitously as well. So the only field that we are comparable to is the physical sciences. So this would be the other physical sciences, right? So when I joke, it's like we're worse in physics, where there's truth to that, right? And physics is considered to be one of the least inclusive fields in the nation, right? So the short answer is, especially once we start moving up the ranks in terms of leadership and the higher level degrees, we're still not doing very well. This is if y'all don't know who Marshall Shepard is, he was former president of the AMS. He's a professor at University of Georgia. He was a NASA scientist before that. He's been recently doing several articles for Forbes, and he wrote an article about why do many minorities avoid science. And what he's saying here is that out of nearly 14,000 members, only 2.1% of the membership is African American. Now, African Americans make up 14% of the population. So that's a severe underrepresentation, right? Now, this is something I want to talk about from a personal story, because this is something I can relate to. Because what he also talks about in this article is some of the perspectives that when he talked to several different scientists as to why this is the case. And one of the big reasons is that this idea of becoming a scientist for many minority communities is still a very new thing. Part of that is when I talked about the intersectionality of the unfortunate relationship between race and class, and especially in terms of poverty, is still very much a problem in this country. So we're dealing with large populations of people who either are still in poverty or have recently risen out of it. So when I was looking at becoming, or what to do for my graduate degree, I actually wanted to be a social scientist, very badly. I actually really distinctly wanted to go into psychology, and I also wanted to study history, because that was one of my favorite subjects. I was very specifically told that there is no way you can get a high-paying job with only a bachelor's degree. With that kind of degree, you would have to get an advanced degree to make any money. Therefore, if you insist on pursuing that, you will not receive help in getting, from my parents, to pursue that education. So I was like, okay, what are my options? I was told engineering or applied science. So even still, though, when I said, okay, I came back and I said, okay, I want to become a meteorologist. My parents said, what can you do with that, with only a bachelor's degree? And I said, I can work for the National Weather Service. That's a stable, good-paying job. They're like, okay, fine, that's acceptable. Now, of course, many years later, here I am with an advanced degree, right? But there's these very real barriers of this notion that, oh, I'm going to now, after my college degree, my undergraduate degree, that I want to spend an additional 6-7 years making $20,000 or less a year, so that I won't even have the potential to start making any kind of serious income until I'm darn near 30. That is more than a lot of families can take, right? So the support of a lot of minority students going into the sciences to become a researcher is does have a tendency to be fairly low. Now there's this other issue, and this is what this quote down here, this was out of a report from the AUW, and they were looking at the problems of diversity across the STEM fields. This particular one came out of computer science, but I think it really relates to our field as well. So the critical part of attracting more girls and women to computer science is providing multiple ways to be in computer science. So if you think about what is the stereotype, especially of a meteorologist or someone who works in weather, you're probably thinking either, a lot of people, the first thing I get asked, are you going to be a weather girl? Makes me mad, but I'm like, no, I don't like to be on camera. That's fine. I'm on camera right now, right? And then the second question I get asked is, oh, are you a storm chaser? I have to say, yes, I actually am. That is true. But there's these certain stereotypes of what it means to be an atmospheric scientist. And of course, there's all that research that shows when you think about what people think about what it means to be a scientist, and they think of an old white guy with glasses and crazy hair with a beaker, in a lab with a white coat, right? We all know that, that's not that's not the only thing that science is about. There definitely are those people, but there's a lot of other people who do science too, but no one thinks about that. And so when you think about getting across to folks what it means to be in science, those are perspectives that have to change for students to even think about it being a viable career option. So this leads to a discussion of what has been called the pipeline. And so this idea of this pipeline, especially for the geosciences and atmospheric sciences in particular, is that, okay, we start with K through 12. Now, we don't get most schools do not have a lot of earth science education in K through 12. You might get it in 7th grade. If you're really lucky, you might get a class in high school. I did not. My only earth science class was in 7th grade. So you typically don't even see this stuff until you get to college. So we're considered a discovery field where there's, a lot of people don't even realize that there's viable career options into the geosciences until they get to college. So then we get an influx of people from other majors that change majors. I was one of those, right? I changed into atmospheric science when I was a sophomore, right? So then some of those people go on to graduate school. We get an influx of more people from other fields who didn't realize in undergrad that atmospheric science is a thing. So then we add some more. And then those people go on to their careers, whatever that means, and we get a further influx of people from people who get PhDs or master's degrees from other fields. Right? We're a highly applied field, and it's just meaning that we take people from many, many, many different areas of expertise, all across the physical sciences, engineering, into the atmospheric sciences, and so there's a wide spectrum of possibilities. But in more recent years, in terms of talking about STEM overall and atmospheric sciences in particular, there's been this idea of the leaky pipeline. that instead of getting this influx of people, or at least a net influx of people into the field, we're actually bleeding off people at every stage, especially in certain groups, mostly in women and underrepresented minorities. So at every stage, say K through 12, there's a lot of research showing that girls are very strongly discouraged from pursuing science and mathematics because it's not seen as a thing that girls do. Thankfully, this attitude has been changing in more recent years, but even especially when I was a kid, this was definitely still a thing. So you lose a bunch of women overall at that stage. Moving over to undergrad, some people choose that maybe they're really interested in the science, but they don't see a viable career option, so they choose not to major in it. They get to undergrad, now they're in a very not welcoming environment, where now they're having to deal possibly with a lot of racism, sexism, homophobia, or transphobia, ableism, all sorts of things, right? So because of the environment that they're being faced with, they choose to leave. Or even if they manage to make it with a degree, they decide, that sucked. I'm not going into graduate school with that, so they leave there. Once they get to graduate school, those issues of inclusion become even worse. So we lose more at that stage. Or even if they manage to make it out with a degree, they're like, screw that, that sucked, I'm leaving. So then they don't go into the field. And then people get into their careers, and the same thing happens over and over, and the numbers are dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. So now at every stage, someone like me, for example, is the only one. And it's really hard to communicate the difficulty of being the only person who looks like you. So what I'm going to go from here is thinking about this, this has been framed in terms of a pipeline that has a bunch of leaks, but rather I would like to change that framework a bit. I've been hearing this framework being talked about more recently, and I really like it. It's talking more about pathways into the atmospheric sciences. And the first step in that pathway is going to be the education of our workforce. And there's this quote that I really like. This is actually from President Johnson, where he talked about what is known as the fifth freedom. So we have our fundamental freedoms in this country. He talked about this being a fifth freedom from ignorance. So education is and should be a fundamental right. And in particular, what he's saying here is that everyone should be free to develop their talents to their full potential, unhampered by arbitrary barriers of race or birth or income. And I can add a few more categories to that as well, right? But these are the ones that, especially at the time, that were being really focused on. So I want to ask you a question. When you think of what is the ideal student, what do you think of? Now, before you think, it's a trap, oh my God, it's a trick question. I really want you to think about this. Are you thinking perhaps of a student being inherently curious, or independent, self-starting, confident, 100% dedicated to their studies, or not distracted by other activities? Are they willing to get up early, work really late, work holidays, weekends, late at night? And are they able and willing to do a lot of extra activities to further their education? And the reason why I really want you to think about that in terms of what it means to be this ideal student is because of this issue. And this leads to a very necessary discussion of what is implicit bias. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because all those things that I listed, although, we see those in the sciences as inherently fundamental traits. But I would also argue that, except for perhaps curiosity, even though I'm going to asterisk on that one, a lot of those are from very privileged positions. The ability to 100% focus on your studies, that's assuming you don't have a kids, family, job, other responsibilities that may be taking away from your time. The ability, that also goes into the ability to do extra activities. When I ran, I brought the Doppler on wheels to campus. I had students who were fundamentally limited on how much they were able to go out with the radar, which was outside of class time, because they had to work a job. I can't ask them to, put this necessary money making away so that you can go with this radar, right? There's a lot of different inherent assumptions that if you really think about what they're based in, they're inherently based in someone that's coming from a particular background with a particular level of economic means. So when we're talking about implicit bias, now this quote actually comes from the area of law. And one reason I'm trying to bring in some perspectives from other fields, because a lot of other fields have been thinking about this a very long time. And I feel like we have a lot of catching up to do in terms of incorporating these ideas into how we pursue science. So back in the 70s, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically found that to prove that there's discrimination in a particular situation, a blameworthy perpetrator had to be identified, either perpetrator or group of perpetrators, or a particular policy, something that was very specific. That put the onus of proof of that discrimination on the person that was alleging it to such a degree that what it resulted in is that it created this imaginary world where if you could not point a finger smoking gun, it was inherently assumed that discrimination did not exist. What this basically led to is basically an ignoring of all of the various different systemic ways that no one individual is guilty of. Yet because of how our system of progression, education, promotion, and everything is structured, inherently disadvantages certain groups. So this is one thing I really want you to think about, because what this is basically saying is that when we talk about especially things like racism, that feeling like, oh my God, am I being called a racist? That's not what we're talking about here. We have to depersonalize the feelings a bit of how we think about these problems. We really need to think about, okay, I may intend very well, but we do have to carefully look at the structures that are in place and start changing them if we want to actually see any real change. So that is that systemic overarching viewpoint of how do we change our system. But what is the work that you can do as an individual? This is something, and I'm hoping to kind of alternate between individual effort and institutional effort. One thing that you can do as an individual is first identify what implicit biases you have. And one thing you fundamentally have to accept is every single one of us has them. We are human. And one thing that I've heard said that I really like, I don't know who said it, is that to notice difference is human. To assign negative traits to that difference, that's bias. So one thing that's really cool is that these researchers at Harvard put together this whole survey system. It's crazy, there's so many in there, that you can go and test to find out what your implicit biases are. Now, one thing that's interesting about this, right, is that there's a very strong possibility that maybe you've been so embedded in social justice and thinking about these issues that maybe your brain has actually overcorrected and started going the opposite direction, right? So everyone has biases. I know I have them, and I think about them and try to combat them every day. But that's the work, that's the individual work that has to be done for everyone in our society to really start making these changes. So, excuse me, when we start thinking about our education system and what we're going to be doing, when we think about what is that ideal student, we do have a tendency to think that there's a very clear pathway to success. First, you go to class, okay, pretty straightforward. And then you study really hard, you get your you get your assignments, and you read your books and papers and whatever. And that, if you study hard, you should result in good grades. And eventually, if you get all your good grades, you will graduate, get your piece of paper saying that you're awesome, and then profit, right? Magic. You should be able to get a job, and all is well in the world, right? One thing I really want you to think about, though, is that for many, many people all across our societal spectrum, this pathway is much more complicated. Starting from the very beginning, can I even afford class? Am I going to be constantly worrying about, do I have the money to do this? Can I afford the books and the materials that I need for that class? Do I have to work? Do I have constant time conflicts? Do I have childcare? Do I have a kid that I have to worry about? I had a student in one of my classes who their child got sick. So they had to, we had to come up with ways to help them make up. When I'm in class, do I feel safe expressing myself? Or do I feel like I'm going to get constantly shot down for having a different viewpoint? If I have a disability, do I have the accommodations that I need to be successful? Or am I going to be constantly struggling to complete basic assignments and complete basic tasks because I don't have the tools that I need? When we're talking about studying, do I have a good environment to study? Maybe, again, if you have a family, maybe you have children running around yelling and screaming, demanding your time. Do I have a good place where I can actually do my work? Did I have enough preparation? This is one that's a big issue. A lot of kids that are coming from underrepresented backgrounds have a tendency to come from schools that, because of the way segregation happened in our education system, may not have had sufficient preparation going into, especially into undergraduate. And they may also not have families that have the culture of education deeply embedded enough to where they can help them figure out how to pursue their studies. One really big one, especially for students of color, is will other students even work with me? Will they study with me? Will they actually include me in those group study sessions? A lot of students actually get left out of that. So then when we move on to the assessment level, getting good grades, is my different way of thinking, my different perspective, is it valued? Or is it just punted aside as not being as important? Are the assessments themselves fair, and are they holistic? Do they value different strengths that people are going to have? Will I be given credit for my work? If I'm working in a group environment, say I may be working with students who may not be thrilled about having to work with me, are they then going to devalue my contribution to the effort? So, okay, man, say you survive all this, and you're trying to get to graduation. Do I have the money to finish? Have I had appropriate advising that is appropriate to my situation? Have I been given constructive feedback? This is a big one, actually, and this is one that's happened to me, where people keep telling you, oh, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great, and then suddenly you're like, oh, but you're not where you're supposed to be. I'm like, well, you've been telling me I've been doing great all this time. Why? It was like, oh, I didn't want to be discouraging. It's like, I needed feedback. I needed real feedback. So then they end up in a storm and in the clouds, and they don't know what happened. So it's this chain all along the way that we start losing people. And a lot of this is for no reason of their own. So then when you start thinking, oh, well, if the student's just dedicated enough, then they'll make it through just fine. It's like, well, if you had to constantly worry about this on top of all the things that you're having to study, how well do you think you're going to do? How much brain space is being taken up by all of these problems? So back in 2004, there was a report that evaluated all of the top performing programs that were doing a really good job in supporting underrepresented groups in the sciences. And these design principles, institutional leadership, targeted and active recruiting, engaged faculty, personal attention, peer support, enriched research experience, so actually doing meaningful experiments, bridging to the next level, providing that career development, and a continuous evaluation were identified as the key components of the program becoming successful. And one big thing, especially when you're talking about underrepresented groups, is financial support. Because again, of that inherent and unfortunate intertwining that tends to happen between race and poverty. So all of these things is what the SOARS program was developed on. there's a reason why SOARS has been so successful. Is because a lot of research went into into making it so successful. If you want to see what baby scientist Deanna looked like back in 2003 when I was doing my SOARS experiment, I had to pull this out of the NCAR archives, and that's why there's a stamp across Wen Chao Li's face, right? But this is the one thing that I cannot help but be so grateful to. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm standing here. Actually, pretty much the only reason why I'm standing here. Because entering the SOARS program so fundamentally changed my career trajectory. As I mentioned, when I thought about what could I do as an atmospheric scientist, I'm like, I'll go in the weather service. Then I went on my first field campaign, and I saw what all these amazing scientists here at NCAR were doing. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is awesome. I should go to graduate school. That completely changed everything for me. So the 5 main components for the SOARS strategy is for the first thing is mentor the whole student. It's not just an issue of mentoring a student in their science. You have to develop a framework of support that takes the entire person into account. The second thing that was identified in that research as what's successful is that so many underrepresented minorities and women are fundamentally driven by wanting to give back to their community. So if they're doing research where they don't do that, they have a tendency to not feel as engaged with it. It's not a, across the board thing, but it does tend to be a higher priority in those groups. Developing a peer network, so having that framework of people that is their age and at their level, sharing that experience, developing a cohort. A lot of students were strongly motivated by being a role model, having the chance to become a role model so that they could be that example for people who are going to be coming after them. And finally, developing healthy coping mechanisms. I just gave you the whole list of all that stuff that people have to think about and deal with, right? Those things, unfortunately, don't seem to be changing anytime soon. And so how do you help a student figure out their ways to do the self-care necessary so that they can be successful and survive all of that stress? So when we think about then how can we improve our training at the faculty level, what do we as faculty members need to do to change the system at a fundamental level? Melissa Burt, another SOARS alum, she's been a diversity advocate up at CSU. Their research identified some very key things in terms of training the faculty themselves so that they can best be prepared to help students along this pathway. The first big one is that, again, one thing we have to keep in mind as atmospheric scientists, we don't deal with humans a lot, right? So there's a lot of people who are experts in dealing diversity issues. So getting that formal training from those experts is really key to helping people understand these issues. One big thing is setting those expectations for the mentors. What kind of level of interaction are you going to have? How much time are you going to dedicate? One big one is designing a meaningful project. So don't just have a student just chug some code for you. Actually help them develop a real scientific project that's going to actually contribute to the field. That seems basic, yet these are things that we take for granted, especially when we're dealing with undergraduates. As SOARS has proven, undergraduates are very, very good at doing very good work if they're given the sufficient support to do it. Part of that, of course, is developing a work plan, really helping them hone how to make a meaningful project in the time that they have to work on it. And then finally, supporting them in career development. Now, this looks familiar, right? I mentioned that Melissa's a SOARS alum. This is fundamentally based on the SOARS model. And they transferred this into an REU program that's become very successful. But one thing that's been great about this is that CSU has been able to massively, massively improve from on the 3% or so to the 16% range of underrepresented minorities in our department. So it's been a massive, massive improvement. So this stuff works. right? It's just how do we apply that to supporting students throughout their education? So this is kind of the future for us. And one thing that's really great, and I'm really honored for, is that I'm working with SOARS right now to develop a year-round support system for students at the University of Illinois. So the one thing about the RU SOARS is that these are summer programs, and even though they can provide support remotely through the year, the students still have to return to their home institution where all those problems that they've been dealing with are still there, right? So how do we develop a year-round support mechanism to where we can support the student, both while they're at the University of Illinois and then when and then continue on at SOARS? And so we're going to be expanding that mentorship model. SOARS really focuses on having multiple mentors at various levels for your research, your writing, your community, and also a peer mentor. Providing those meaningful research opportunities and to give people more flexibility. Maybe they can't run off to Boulder every summer, right? Maybe they need to stay in the community for one reason or another. So being able to provide those research opportunities both at their home institution or at NCAR. And then also engaging these students in year-round professional development so that what they're learning in SOARS can continue throughout the year. Now, one thing that is really important, though, is that when we're talking about recruitment, especially into the atmospheric sciences, this issue of two-year universities comes up, and it's a major problem. This picture here is from when I brought the Doppler on Wheels to campus, and this group of students that I'm standing with is one of the classes from Parkland College, which is our local community college. I really wanted to make sure to bring them because this is where most of our underrepresented students are. They're not at the University of Illinois. So how do we increase that exposure, and then how do we smooth that transition for students that are coming from a two-year university? Because one thing that's really common about atmospheric science programs is that they start very early. They usually start freshman year. So if you're coming in at year 3, you're typically very behind because most two-year colleges do not offer the coursework necessary to keep you on track so that when you enter the 4-year framework that you're on schedule. Which means, among other things, that all those financial savings you may have been trying to get going to a two-year college get obliterated by having to spend an additional year at the 4-year university. So this leads to the question of the science by all. So who do we have pursuing science? And this graphic is, again, showing scientists and engineers and science and engineering occupations. You see that this whole chunk of the pie are by white women and men, and then our underrepresented population is this very small chunk. And if just focusing on black folks, African Americans, total representing only 5% of the scientific workforce, when again we represent 13-14% of the population. So some severe, again, some very significant underrepresentations in these areas. Which reads another question. Who do you see as an ideal scientist? So you're probably thinking again, it's that, right? But what are the qualities that you see in thinking about who makes an ideal scientist? What kinds of problems do they work on? What kind of work ethic do they have? Like, how much of their life are they dedicating to science? Are they dedicating all of it? Is science both their work pursuit and also all of their hobbies? Do they have families? Do they have, how much time do they spend with those families? Do they, do they work in other areas? So one thing I want to talk about is, so this is a group of some of the amazing women that were early alumna from the SOARS program. There's me in the middle. One thing I want to point out, though, is that only a couple of us work in academia. A few more work in research science positions. A fair number don't work in atmospheric sciences at all anymore. They decided to take their talents to other fields. So one thing is that question of, is that a failure? I would say no. I think there's many different pathways to success. And I couldn't even put all the different areas where atmospheric scientists can end up, right? This is just some. But we have this from the undergraduate. The undergrads may go into other fields. They may go to the private sector. They can go all over the place to all these different areas. If they choose to go to a master's, the same thing. They can go all over the place. PhD, same thing. They can go all over the place. And one thing that I couldn't do and couldn't draw is all the arrows between these. Because then it would have just been an insane massive arrows and you wouldn't have been able to read it. So there's all sorts of interconnections that can happen. And the thing that I want to argue is that that's a good thing. Because if we really want to truly, get that diversity of thought, then wouldn't it be awesome that if the person that, was teaching you at a university first, maybe got their master's and then decided to go, okay, I'm going to go to computer science and do that for a while. And, okay, maybe I want to change tax. Now I'm going to go become a research academic. Then maybe I go back to the private sector. And then now I've decided maybe I'm going to go back to my PhD. And now I'm a professor. Wouldn't that be cool? Can you imagine getting advised on different, pathways and career experiences and things like that with someone who's had that breadth of experience? That'd be pretty awesome. Instead, we do have a tendency to value this one very linear pathway and then either to there, maybe there, I guess, right? So I think we really need to think about how do we value different career pathways? So since I'm an academic, I'll talk about academia itself specifically. I realize I'm going really slow, so sorry, I should speed up. I warned people I could talk about this for forever. So you see that, in terms of assistant professors in the atmospheric sciences, about 30% are women right now. You can see that precipitously drops off with promotion. So associate professors down to 20%, full professors down to 15%. So there is this problem of promoting women, underrepresented minorities up the chain. And when you think about what leads to this, if you haven't read PhD comics, please do. It's hilarious. I love it. But this pie chart is actually from research. This is, how it's been shown that professors predominantly spend their time. Huge chunk on teaching, a significant chunk on service, and only actually a relatively small part of the pie on research. And this is especially bad when you're early career, like me, right? That's in direct contrast to how you're expected to spend your time. It's not really this bad, but I think it makes a point where you're expected to spend all your time in research. Teaching, and I should say this is from the perspective of an R1 institution, right? If you're at a teaching institution, this perspective changes quite a bit. Service is punted off here to the side. Yeah, you should do it, but it's over there somewhere. And basically, most professors are like, just leave me alone. I just want to do what I want to do. The point I want to make with this, though, this is an inherent problem in academia overall. But especially if you're a woman or an underrepresented minority, the fact that you're teaching in your service is seen as such a sideshow. When I said that a lot of women and underrepresented minorities are inherently driven by wanting to give back to their community, yet the amount they're going to be valued for doing so is tiny. So you end up in this situation where how you're actually spending your time does not reflect how you're going to be valued for promotion. So now that chart I showed before, the bar chart starts making sense. When women go up for tenure, they're saying, oh, you haven't done enough real science, so we're not giving you tenure. And that actually was found as a result of a National Academy's report some years ago. So this gets to this question of how do we value service, especially teaching as well, but I want to talk about service. One thing that I dedicated myself to is I will not give up doing outreach, education, work, and diversity, and policy, which is also a love of mine. This is a picture I did the AMS Summer Policy Colloquium back in 2009. This is a community engagement group, a community engagement event that we did when I brought the Doppler wheels on campus. This is me actually recording a science podcast for children called Brains On. So I was at the local NPR station doing that recording. I simply refuse to not do these things because these are the things that feed my soul. These are the things that make me happy. So the notion of putting my head down and just doing my work I see this as my work. I see this as a fundamental contribution to science and to society. So to say to not do it, I think is extremely unfair and extremely disadvantaging to the people who are driven to do this by what they want to give back to their community. So I think what is needed is that we really need to change the evaluation model. And the reason why is because we're going to have a very hard time getting more people to do this if we don't reward them for doing it. So one thing that the Bird et al. Paper pointed out is that at CSU, one reason why they've been so successful at this mentoring program is because it's now seen as a very valuable thing to do. It's recognized in faculty evaluations. So until we change the model to say that, no, this is important and we're going to give you credit for doing it, not just see it as a side gig, this is going to be a very difficult thing to change. The final thing I want to point out, though, is this issue of, do we really think we can do it all? As I said, we're atmospheric scientists. We don't deal with human beings. We deal with the atmosphere. So if we have something like this, right? This is Hurricane Katrina making landfall. And we want to get people to this, right? There's a whole lot of human brains between this thing and that thing. That's something that we don't work on. So do we really think, are we actually really so arrogant to think that we know what to say and how to communicate to people and interact with people so we can get people from this to that? I think that takes a lot of hubris to make that assumption. And so I argue that if we really want that diversity of thought, for the kinds of problems that atmospheric scientists address, we need to bring in other people. This is where things like was-is, that whether integrated with society, things come in, where we're inherently bringing in social scientists at the fundamental level to develop projects where we can actually holistically deal with these problems and not just assume that we know what's best for other people. So part of that is that I've been working with this 21st Century Sciences Working Group, which is an actual effort at the University of Illinois across the sciences at the university. So, and actually some of the biggest leaders in this group are anthropologists, right? So we're really working to try to make science inclusive, using it to promote diversity, have positive incentives for engagement, and innovation in 21st century training and connecting to society. So how is the best ways that we can use our science to help society and make it an inclusive science? So finally, I promise I am wrapping up, is this issue for science for all. This is a poster also from the March of Science. And I just really liked it because I really like this idea of science for the common good. What does this mean? And that brings me back to this picture. One thing that I thought was absolutely phenomenal about the March for Science in Urbana-Champaign was that they made a very, very intensive effort to bring in all of the necessary community groups together. They really, really fundamentally featured women scientists, scientists from underrepresented minorities, and immigrant scientists. So one scientist actually had a very touching story about all of the threat of deportation that scientist is facing because they're Iranian. And yet they're doing all this work for us here in the United States. These are fundamental issues that people are trying to face when they're trying to pursue their science. So what I loved about this is this really started a conversation of how can these community groups and all these scientists come together and have this conversation so that we can actually do community-oriented science. So my final question for you is, what's stopping you from doing this engagement? And before you think again, I promise, right? I really want to think what's your hesitation? Like what are you thinking that might be making you nervous about doing that? Is it, do you just not want to? Okay, I mean, not everyone's meant to be a super outgoing, public engagement person. Is there someone you can partner with? Can you even maybe just see it as, okay, well, you have to do data editing. Data editing's not fun either, but you do it, right? Can you maybe change the mindset that this is a fundamental component of pursuing science, not just something that's a side gig. Do you not know how? Do you not know who to talk to? Well, reach out, find someone who does, right? A lot of these communities have become inherently distrustful of science for a lot of good reasons, and one of those reasons is that, well, we typically have a tendency to only show up when we need something for our broader impact statement on our NSF grants. So how do you change that? How do you actually make real, good connections? Does your institution not value it? Well, I would say, see that earlier evaluation system, right? That's something that needs to fundamentally change. So what are some things that you can do on an individual level? When you're thinking about your scientific problems, think about all of the stakeholders. Who are all the people that could possibly be affected by your science? What are the various communities involved? Various private sector businesses? What various governments, especially if you work internationally, but even in the United States? You know, there's local, state, federal level things that you can think about. One thing that's very important is making the time to listen. It really sucks when someone just comes to you and says, I have the solution to your problem, and they haven't even listened to what the problem actually is yet, right? So don't go in assuming that you know what the answer is. Take the time to listen. And then finally, like I said, consider how to make a long-term impact, not a one-off, I'm only showing up so I can write this thing on my broader impact statement on my grant. So the take-home message, and this is where I'll end, is that diversity makes for better science and better scientists. I think it's fundamentally crucial that this is something that we really work on as a scientific enterprise as a whole and in atmospheric sciences in particular. Both individual and institutional effort is required to make lasting change. So I really encourage you to start thinking about what are the things I can do on an individual level to help this happen. And especially if you're in a position of leadership, what can I do at an institutional level to start fundamentally changing these structures? And then finally, this issue of this community-driven science. More people need to be brought into the science conversation. So really making sure that when you're thinking about what problems we're addressing, who we're doing this science for, making sure that everyone's brought to the table, not just the usual suspects. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you for this powerful talk. Questions, comments from the audience?
Great talk, by the way. So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how businesses have come to value diversity. And I don't want to be negative, but I feel like part of the reason for that is because it's market driven and they're trying to appeal to a diverse community, and so they need diversity on their panels or whatnot to basically appeal to those customers. And whereas in science, you've talked a lot about how we have this canon kind of for what's a good scientist and how exactly people should act and pursue science. And maybe that is part of why for a long time we've undervalued diversity, is because even diversity of thought isn't really valued, right? Like there's a prescribed method for doing X, Y, or Z, and creativity and curiosity aren't often part of that.
No, I totally agree. And I should say that, there's two problems with what I said earlier about the businesses, right? The first being, I'm not saying that the people are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. Not at all. It's completely, as you said, it's market driven. It's basically, it's like folks have realized that this helps them make more money, right? The second issue, though, is that, and this is something that I have noticed in numerous areas, there's a lot of people who are talking the talk, but when it actually comes to walking the walk, it's a completely different matter. If you look at the tech sector, for example, their diversity numbers are atrocious, right? And have been for a long time. It's been an identified thing, and yet it's been an extremely stubborn problem to change. And so I think there is a recognition in a lot of the business community that this is something that's necessary, but how they actually change their corporate structure to make it happen is a completely different beast. When you're talking about science, yes, I think you're 100% right in that we have really prescribed in a lot of ways. This is how you do things. This is how you approach science. This is how you progress through your career. This is what career is valued. If you're not doing that, then you're a failure. So, whatever. So I think the answer to that, it has to change. That like a lot of these things I'm talking about are going to be very stubborn problems until that attitude changes, and that we start seeing these multiple different pathways, these multiple different experiences as perfectly good and viable things. Because one thing, when I was talking about all those different pathways, life happens a lot to a lot of people, and certain kinds of life tends to happen to some people more than others. And so, you know, when you start talking about promotion and things like that, this issue of having children along this pathway, right? This is one that's a very common problem. Now, in academia, we have the tenure clock rollback, for example. So you can delay your tenure a year. Grants don't care about babies, right? So if you have staff and, you know, research projects and things that you have to keep funding despite the fact that you're on maternity leave or paternity leave, that really doesn't change a lot of things. You might not have to teach anymore, but that's really the only responsibility that goes away. And so there's a lot of, like I said, those fundamental structures that have to be addressed. And until we change our mindset about those structures, then they're going to be difficult to really address.
Any other questions?
Uh-oh.
Great talk, thank you. You know us well, you've been at NCAR, you collaborate with SOURCE, you've been in SOURCE. Looking now kind of back and seeing us from a distance, what could NCAR do to help improve the situation in the atmospheric sciences?
Thankfully, I've been asked this one before, so I don't know if I have any better of an answer than I did at the time that one either. But so I will say, so you probably noticed that the bulk of the research papers and citations and everything that I had were in the first chunk of the talk. There's been so much focus on getting people into school, supporting them through school, getting them to graduate school. That's wonderful, right? That's addressing that first chunk of the problem. The problem is we still have major gaps in those latter two areas. So one thing I think needs to be addressed, for one thing, providing the support for this faculty training, I think is a big one, right? Because a lot of universities do have these kinds of things in-house, especially larger universities, but there are particular challenges to the atmospheric sciences that I do sometimes think that NCAR may be better suited to helping address than an institution that has to deal with many, many different fields and many, many different challenges. The other thing, though, is this question of the early career, especially the early career scientists. So what happens after a student, once a student gets into graduate school, and then also what happens to them once they graduate, become postdocs, or they become early career faculty, or they go into the private sector, what have you. I think this particular problem was actually, I think it's kind of odd that it's only recently really addressed in the AMS in terms of finally developing early career activities and a support network at the annual meeting, but that's only, like 5 years old, something like that? So this issue of how do you support early career scientists, I think, is a really, really, really critical one. And again, especially supporting them in our relatively strange and unique field. So yeah, I think that's something, and maybe we can talk about brainstorming some ideas on that.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
One thing that I've been seeing happening in the past couple of years, a lot of institutions, NCAR included, and a lot of universities have started setting up like these offices of diversity or hiring a dean of diversity. And I've heard arguments that this may not be the best way to go. We should be taking all this money to pay for administration and overhead and all this other executive costs and actually putting it towards, funding some sorts of scholarships or things like that. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, that's a hard one. So No, and actually, it's funny because we're actually having this exact argument on our campus as we speak, and that especially with budgets becoming tighter and tighter, the effort to more streamline these efforts is, they say it's to make them more streamlined. I think it's probably more to save money, right? Now, there is the question of, especially when dealing with a large campus like the University of Illinois, there is a question of how much are you reinventing the wheel? If you have, both this overarching Office of Inclusion, OIIR, right? But then you also, every unit and department and everything has their own efforts that's going on. There does become that question of how much are you reinventing the wheel? But the thing is, much like I sometimes think about our federal budget in terms of where our priorities lie, it's like really of all the things that the university is spending time on, the thing that they think they first put it on the chopping block is the diversity initiatives. To me, that might show my bias, but to me that is highly specious at best. And yes, I understand, of course, especially in universities, that where money goes from donations and things like that, it's a very, very complicated web of funding, right? And so, sometimes it gets difficult to see that, administration overhead, things like that is getting cut and cut and cut. Yet these new, residence halls and things are being thrown up. You're like, really? And a lot of that's driven more by donations than, and money from donors than anything else. But if we're really seeing diversity and inclusion as a priority university, then I think that in this country, we show where our priorities are by where we put our money. If that's the first thing that's on the chopping block versus all the other things, then I think that's showing that it's not really a priority at all.
All right. Let's thank our speaker again. And Deanna will be here for the rest of the week, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so...
I'm very excited because I'm going to have my very first SOAR student of my own, so I'm very excited to be here for that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys.